Till my Welcome to Speak Sex. I am your host, Eurydice, and today we're going to talk about war again, because that's all that we're hearing, watching, breathing, thinking, and war is the other side of sex, at least in patriarchy, at least for the last 7,000 years. So my guest today is Dana Wahab. She's a writer and educator and a first-generation Lebanese. Welcome to the show, Dana.
Thank you. Hi.
Hi. We have had lots of long conversations about belonging to these like tiny minorities in an increasingly kind of like global and American world. And you're Druze, which is, I think, a smaller minority even than the Greeks.
Yes.
So I wanted to get your take about what's happening in the Ukraine theater right now, and your response to kind of like war in the 21st century, because your family and your people have been, enmeshed in one type of war or another throughout the 21st century. I mean, Lebanon has pretty much been in the middle of, intense or not so intense civil war for most of your life. And it's a perfect example of like a cosmopolitan city that was famous for having so many minorities coexist and prosper. And when we think of the 21st century as post-war, and when we're saying, oh my God, I'm so shocked, how could this be happening in 2022? And it's like, well, it's been happening, it's just not on TV all the time, but it's been happening around the world. And this is the main tool of patriarchy in my opinion. So anyway, I'd like to hear a bit about your background and as I said, your response to this war in comparison and in connection to the war that you've been hearing about and experiencing when you're in Beirut.
Yeah.
Your parents are there now, right?
My parents are there now, yes. And they got married in the middle of the Civil War, which is why my mother had my brothers and I here in Miami while my father stayed in the Middle East. And they both have their own different experiences in the Civil War in Lebanon, both terrifying in their own ways. And even though I grew up in America, which has its own kind of isolation that comes with it, I still spent a lot of time in Lebanon, and months out of every year, and my father always lived there, so there was always a sort of like back and forth between the two places. And it's you kind of nailed it when you were just talking about the war in the Ukraine and how it's not surprising, or how people are saying like, how could this be happening in 2022? Because I think, overall the emotion is heartbreak for me, but it's certainly not a new kind of heartbreak, especially because especially being raised by people who lived through a war and continue to live through so much chaos in Lebanon. It's always just been a part of them, and like this sort of somber shade to their existence. And I feel, it's heartbreaking and it's sad and it's upsetting, but it's not new, and I feel that it just so clearly fits into the greater pattern of humanity and the patriarchy and the way that the world works. And it's hard to even get into discussions about it because, focusing on the details is almost like ignoring, the reality of how we've come to this point.
Right. Well,
how we've made it here.
well, let's just, unpack this for a second. Like, what are the details? Like, what are people fighting about in this tiny country, for example? Because I think it's just an example of what is going to happen now in Ukraine, which is another, of this, endless wars. But what are we fighting about?
Yeah, well, that's a good question, and on the one hand, I can't pretend to be so tuned in to the understandings of a culture that I don't come from, that I know the details, but I almost feel like they become pointless in the sense that, maybe pointless isn't the right word, but they become they lose some of their depth when they all kind of become just reflections of maybe vying for certain powers, ownership, or all of those structural things that as a culture we deem important, or that are important in the pyramid of the patriarchy, if that makes sense. Like in Lebanon, it's there's so much fighting, and you can talk about how, it's a difference in beliefs, or it's, an argument. Sometimes it's an argument between families that burgeons into this political clash that brings in all the other people into it, all the other innocent people into it as well, and loyalties and trust and this tribal kind of way of thinking that drives all of these decisions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the tribe. Well, I feel like, okay. So like on the surface, right, superficially, the way it's presented to the West, it's the Christians fighting the Hezbollah, Muslims who are fighting. Well, the Druze. Everybody's fighting the Druze, right? So
yeah. The Druze are constantly trying. They're constantly trying to stay neutral, but they also have their own political factions who, are no less guilty than the others.
Mm-hmm. So even though, it's kind of like, like headlined by religious, categories, it's not that simple. It is tribal, right? And it has kind of like a primal, ancient feeling to it.
Yeah.
And there is such a tiny bit of territory. I mean, there isn't even oil.
Yeah.
So what are these tribes, fighting about, and why can't we make peace is the question, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, there's so many different, it's totally tribal, and it's one of the most ironic aspects is that, if any of them were smart enough to actually, use the country's resources to their advantage, they would probably be a way for them to stay wealthy and powerful while not destroying the country and the people in which they live in. But I think change is so difficult for so many reasons, but one of them being that everybody is so plugged in to the different tribes and the ways in which they work. So let's say there's a political leader in Lebanon who could have, is a war criminal and could have committed atrocities, but if maybe he pays you $20 a month and that's what gets your kids through school or what gets food on the table, and it's like you pledge your loyalty to this person who is the reason that you have food on the table and why your family was able to go to college. And they run really deep, these ties, and it's rare somebody who can make it I don't know anybody who independently can make any sort of business or any sort of major decision that doesn't run by that doesn't have to be work in tandem with or be run by one of these little leaders who pretty much build up their own little kingdom of power that everybody works to serve in some way.
Right. Like to simplify it, like the mafia or,
Yes.
In the Godfather movies, let's say.
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah. Which is, again, like exactly, how, the patriarchy works by, through, in my opinion, through fear, intimidation, threat of like physical violence, severe punishment, and of course, like the mythos, right? The mythos of like mythologizing like loyalty, mythologizing, taking sides, mythologizing, the stories of the past, the narratives that it constructed, to keep us together, right?
Yes.
That are not true.
Yes.
So that's, I think that partly, it plugs us into the past, and we can turn around and go to the future. Like each generation is almost like a link. And, if we could just switch, and become like a generation of difference or of reversal, and not do things the way they were done by our parents, we would switch into a better future, but we don't. We just cannot make that turn. And America, plays a role in it because, America has like the unique position of being a country that's never been conquered before. And, the American promise and the American, difference and all of that stuff. So people like, your mom or myself, who so many people who came and continue to come here, have had this ideal, in our minds that America is going to deliver us from, like, the insanity of this kind of like ancient inherited, like, hatreds, this is like my ancestral enemy that by the accident of my birth I am sworn to hate, like
yes, yeah.
I happen to be born into these people, so I'm born with my hatred of like another people. It comes it's just it's when you think about it with any rationality, it's just mind-blowing.
Yes.
But America keeps taking sides. Like instead of just taking the side of peace and never taking side in any conflict whatsoever, which would justify the way that America presents herself to the rest of us, right? In the old world, it keeps taking sides. It keeps like living, like its little bubble, post-historical bubble. Geographically, I mean, its own borders, and going all over around the world, and in the name of being the peacekeeper, actually taking sides and, feeding wars and selling weapons and saying, participating in this like ancient binary of like who's good and who's bad, like seeing every conflict that America understands very little about, because this stuff is so, complicated and not rational, and saying, oh, okay, I got it. This is the good guy. This is the bad guy. So I'm going to like, help this side, and then perpetuating, and magnifying these old conflicts instead of like helping resolve them. So for me, at least, that's what I have felt, watching, like this war has reminded me that, and, this is how, America has disappointed me, despite also being a first generation, like believer in the American project and dream. Each time, I mean, in so many wars, in my lifetime, even before I had consciousness, like, from Vietnam on, America just, it happened in Iran, and it created the Ayatollah, and it has led to what's been happening in Iran since to this day,
Yeah.
all over South America. So, far-flung, in Cyprus, far-flung parts of the world. And, conflict, war is not that simple. Like, no one is innocent, but also everybody's innocent, right? So
Yeah.
we should only promote peace, not either side, but that's not what, America is doing.
Yeah.
And it, what I find heartbreaking is that that's not what we're told in our news at all. So we're like,
Yeah.
good guy, bad guy, good guy, bad guy. This is who we hate. This is who we love and admire, and
Yeah.
every time there is a war, it's like that, Saddam, bad, like, whatever, Sadr, good. I mean, what? Who? Gaddafi, good. No, wait, no, Gaddafi, bad. Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
then the other warlord, good, because he's like against the bad. Well, it's just, it's taking on the very, like tropes
Yes.
that we wanted to escape by coming to America.
Yeah. It's very sensationalized.
Yeah.
And it's very contradictory because it's like America, it does offer so many of those things, like you and I both feel that, the freedom to live our lives in many ways, in the ways in which we choose to, but then at the same time, it does disappoint us in the ways in which that you mentioned. So it's like this contradiction within the American dream and the reality that's given to this, like with all the responsibility that's given to this country and what they could be doing. And it is definitely disappointing to see how things are handled and to just see the continuation of sensationalized storytelling. It makes it very difficult, and I think that it's like a wheel that keeps turning, and it just you just have to hope you're not in the minority that's going to be bad next.
Yeah, or majority, like we've just made an enemy of the entire, like, Russian, whatever, like hundreds of millions of Russians, and who did not themselves have anything to do with this aggression.
Yes, exactly.
So now this is going to go on for a generation.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's I read that it was in November that this war, like, officially began in November, I think November 10, 2021, when Biden and Zelensky, like, signed a charter on strategic partnership, which said that America supported Kiev's right to pursue membership in NATO. And I mean, we did that when we knew that Ukraine could not join NATO right away, that the rest of the NATO countries didn't want it in because it had contested borders. By letting them into NATO, we would have to take on Ukraine's fight over its borders with Russia, right? So why did we have to do that? Like, to just push a button and create such chaos and suffering and loss of life and treasure and
while also somehow like dodging accountability.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. We're always the angel of good. Which again, like the good and evil, that's how this, this kind of patriarchic duality works. If we were all one, then this couldn't happen. So tell us a little. I wanted to ask you, for our listeners, to talk a little about the Druze people.
Yeah. Well, the Druze, it's quite a small religion, and it's the communities are centrally focused right in Lebanon, Syria, and Israel, and then there's the diaspora. And it's interesting in many ways because it's similar to some Eastern religions, you could say, like Buddhism. They believe in reincarnation, and on paper, like many religions, it's quite beautiful. I'm not religious. And so beyond that, beyond those philosophical thoughts, I find it hard to reconcile that with reality, because socially and culturally, I think they fall into many of the same tropes as other religions, and they have a history of being like of wanting to be neutral in situations like this. But I don't think that really matches. I sometimes I think that's a bit of a willing blindness to the reality.
It has some elements from like Plato and Aristotle and Pythagoras and the ancient Greek mysteries, and it's got, it has like Arabic. It's kind of Arabic speaking, so it has the Arabic part of it, the Abrahamic monotheistic, part. It also shares like with Judaism, the ethnic, the sense of like this is a people as well as as well as a faith. And I think that the main text is like the epistles of wisdom, which again, I don't know. I find it so interesting that it is able to combine like monotheism and reincarnation, which, as you say, is more Eastern, scripture, which is more Judaic or Judeo-Christian, theophany, which is more maybe evangelical, and then kind of like I think that they honor like prophets from all of these faiths,
They don't hold one over the other, but there's value in all of them, and they play a role in their greater storyline. In their greater storyline. And I think it's the idea of reincarnation, but also that there's no heaven or hell. It's all like here in this life, and what you make of it. And they believe that your choices in this life dictate your situation in your next life.
Right. Which is kind of like a Judeo-Christian Arabic karma version of karma.
Totally. But I've always been in a very precarious position because I think because I'm a woman. But the religion is also very they keep to themselves. They don't preach. They don't even allow converts. They used to quite a long time ago. And my brother is sort of a scholar on the subject, and he explained to me that they used to, but then they stopped because people were converting for the wrong reasons. I don't know. He gave me some reasoning like that, but because of their sort of secretive nature, but fervent belief in what their way is the truth. And me not only being a woman, but being raised in America, I've always been in this strange position, in between sort of position where I'm often sort of being called back into it, while at the same time being told that I could never really understand it because of my upbringing. My grandfather was a priest. There was like someone in the family who became a saint, but my faith was very much in the hands of men, right? So there was definitely like, as a woman, you could do like, understand and perform really secondary, roles, but it's, like if you menstruate, you can't go into at all, like you can't go into church. It's so there was definitely like a very clear, all-time patriarchal angle. Yes. Yeah. And I feel that even the women in my family or beyond who are in religious positions of power, you could say, although they would never explain their positions that way, but they do hold power. I see it in the way that they are followed by the people and their place in society as a position of power. And even when they are women or females, I do see it fall into the same pattern, because the patriarchy, it doesn't really distinguish even though it's historically associated with men, right? And obviously it's based off of the sort of male, the male perspective and building of culture. But at the same time, even if there's a woman at the top of that pyramid, it's still the same pyramid.
Right. I mean, God is a he, and he, he is wise and and just and might. And so, it kind of like supports the whole construct. Because, he is the whole of existence. And so, whereas like I feel that God's the whole of existence because I feel that God is like, in nature. But, the way when we put it in words, which is dogma, like, God gets a gender.
Yes. Yeah.
It's like, wait, how is God like
how does that
transcendent, but also like a guy?
Yeah. Exactly.
But it is, I just, I think it's a great heritage. However, like a lot of our, again, Judeo-Christian, Muslim stories, it comes with like a geographic lock, right? I think. I mean, you know better than I do, but like the same way that like Jerusalem means so much to like Jews and Christians and Muslims.
Yeah, and especially because there are no converts. It's like it's not even, I don't know if it's even so much as a question of like having holy sites. It's just like if no one can convert to it, then there certainly aren't, communities sprouting up all over the world. It's really coming out of
Lebanon,
coming out of one place. Yeah.
And you guys like you have to have Lebanon is my point. Like I think the Mount of Lebanon or whatever, but I think that's part of like that agrarian. It's one of those tools. It's the agrarian tool. Of patriarchy. So if war is one of the tools of the patriarchy, that kind of like geographical, limitation, right? Is another tool. Because this is what we fight about. We fight about our borders. And what are our borders? They're based on these stories that we're told, right? So like
an inheritance and stories of like what belongs.
Right.
What belongs
to whom? And I mean, rationally speaking, when we look at, like if we could remove the emotion, from it, and we look at it rationally, we could say, all land is stolen. Like, who was the first person to say this is mine, and what? How did that become, his or hers? Like, it's just even the first one to lay claim was a colonizer. I mean, it's just like Earth. And then you say it's mine, and then someone else says, "Well, no, I don't want. I want it to be mine, right?" And then the most brutal one prevails, I guess. I mean,
Yes.
So this kind of like sense of like the right. This is our right. Is already corrupt, but we grow up with it. And what I'm saying, we were talking about the reasons for war. Well, there they are, like there is Russia, and Russia is like, no, Kiev used to be our capital, Ukraine was Greater Russia, it's the same thing that has forced like Israel and Palestine to have perennial war. Because of the stories that kind of bound their people to the same like geographical spot. It's like if after World War II, having sacrificed like 6 million lives, the Jewish people were given by the great powers, the equal land in like, let's say, West Texas, which was empty. We're now we test rockets. Or one of my favorite suggestions always was Cyprus,
Yeah.
which is
Yeah.
like an island, and
Yeah.
has been occupied anyway since like 74 by the Turks.
Yeah.
So, but somewhere where there wouldn't be and endemic war,
Yeah.
it would be a totally different existence. I think like the consciousness of being a Jew would be profoundly different, by now.
Yeah.
But instead they continue to feel persecuted, and sometimes I even ask myself, like, was this done on purpose, like by those whoever, the Brits? I think the Brits decided, because it was a British colony or protectorate, they call it.
Yeah.
Because to kind of say, okay, this is where you can go because you have to, because of your faith, but of course this is also where you can go where you will always be hated. You will never be safe, because it's someone else's faith too, right?
Yeah.
We're going to give you a place that is full of your enemies.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
yeah. So
Yeah. And
yeah.
I think I think, something you said, like, in the past, I think it was, the most brutal was the winner, right? The people with the brute force. And I think that has, life and humanity and culture has changed so much that it's no longer just about who is the strongest. And I think that's, maybe, I mean, I'm oversimplifying, but I think that's where a lot of complications come in now, because, that's how so many different societies and countries were made and built and whatever. But it's no longer so simple as like who is the most powerful or who has the brute force. And America is a good example of that, because it's no longer just like the driving factor of like who's in charge and who knows what's right.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that pretty much, again, I don't, if we go back to the beginnings of patriarchy, we can't really pinpoint it, because this is all we know is our culture. But pretty much soon after, might makes right? Pretty much after like the use of brutal force to kind of like, set up the pyramid of power. Propaganda became an equally important tool of war.
Yes.
So like war is brutality and violence, but also intellect,
Yes.
using culture, language, is another kind of violent enforcer of these truths, right? So like language to me is very phallic. I feel it as as a violator, because all these stories keep us chained to these roles, to the social roles that we're told we have no choice but to adhere to.
Totally.
And if we don't do our part, we will be nameless and homeless and identityless, right? And then here we are, like in America, with identity wars and identity politics. And it's exactly, identity politics is exactly what we see in Ukraine and Russia, what we see with like, the sides in Lebanon fighting again and again, what we see, in Israel or, Iraq. So, I think that the way that, storytelling has been used, it has been as another instrument of, war and conquest. Yeah.
Which makes being a writer very complicated. It's like a weird thing where like you want to and need to use words to speak, but at the same time I feel like my hands are always tied because of the nature of language, as you explained it.
Yeah. And especially, and I think that's why sometimes you go to fantasy, because it feels more freeing. And especially as a woman writer, even more so, because you're like, well, it's the same thing as the male gaze. Like there is no such thing as a female gaze. We all see each other through the male gaze, and we all speak to each other through like this male language. And
Yeah.
so, as women writers, when we get out of that, we have the conundrum of not being understood.
Yeah, totally. Totally.
It's like either gibberish,
Yeah.
either tender buttons,
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
or like becoming part of the system, collaborating or collaboration.
Yes.
with
Yeah.
enemy.
Gibberish or collaboration.
Yeah.
That's exactly it.
So we end up being collaborators because we
Yeah.
we don't want to be like a voice in the desert.
Yeah.
But I think having these stark, like reminders of war, coming down our newsfeed, is an opportunity, let's say, a terrible opportunity, to kind of like try to understand once again, all over again, what this is, where it comes from, why we're not overcoming, our this kind of like instincts. They may be instincts or they may be epigenetic instincts. We really don't know.
Yeah. True.
Yeah. Like patriarchies. Scientists and anthropologists, say, well, we always used to fight each other, but like when we only know up to what we can like decipher, and like our bias is so all encompassing that you can look at a like Paleolithic site and there's so little there, and you interpret it based on what you know of humanity. Yeah.
Which is very limiting.
Right. So
in many ways,
whether or not it's an instinct or it's a learned instinct through patriarchy, I think is an impossible question to answer. Whether or not we used to be hunter-gatherer, nomadic pacifists is an impossible question to answer.
Yeah. But annoyingly, it's the question. It's the question we keep asking.
Yeah.
And keep going back to.
Yeah. Like, looking for a way, an alternative, like a way to evolve out of things.
Yeah. Yeah. I think in Lebanon, I think that the younger generation, at least, those people I know who were like, who I grew up with and spent time around, they want change, and they don't fall into the same traps as their parents, but the system is so strong, and it's like, how do they initiate change? I really don't know, and my parents, even after all of everything they've been through and what the country continues to put them through, they still have faith and like hope that they have faith in the system and hope that things will just, like, at the next election, our next chance is in the election, whereas I think people my age, of my generation, are so tapped out emotionally and psychologically that they have no faith in it at all, and I think it's such an overwhelming object to overcome, not like change on such a grand scale. There's so much change that needs to be done.
Exactly.
But where to even begin, or how to even go about it?
Yeah. Where do you? Yeah. You're in your 20s, and I think that's pretty accurate for your generation in America as well as in the Middle East. But the way I see it is that it's the solution is money, in the money, in the use of money, because as we look at generational change, it's generations get bought by older generations, and their opinions and ideals and, kind of like decisions and choices get bought through money by their, let's say, forefathers or foremothers, right? Sooner or later. So the way, for me, into my logic, the way out of this endless like cycle of repetition is by changing how, where the money goes, how the money is distributed. Because if we inherit our parents financially, or if we are hired by our bosses who support us financially, we, ever so slowly like shift in the direction that works for them. And, without quite consciously, knowing it, in a few decades, right, we become them. And the solution clearly is not, socialism or like, taking over, the means of production and giving it to like the masses, or whatever, whatever has been proposed, which just repeats the same, ways of control. But it has to do with money. And in my opinion, inheritance. And I because that's how I've experienced it in my life, where, when you kind of like take over from your father or parents, or mentor, you consider that it is your, almost your duty or your debt, to them, to kind of like continue what they were doing, in exchange for having been received, which is really having been paid to continue what they're doing, right? So it's almost like a Ponzi scheme, but we don't think of it that way because we put it in these very noble terms. It's all like morality, and ethics and and respect, and whatever. Which is what makes this so, like it's a knot, it's so complicated. But, I do feel that knots can be untied. Women can do that at least. We know how to like, stitch and make a knot and untie a knot. And, like Alexander the Great had to cut the knot, with his sword. And that's like, to me, symbol of what patriarchy, does. Every time there is a big change and it doesn't work, like revolution doesn't work. Bloody revolution, especially.
Just perpetuates the same.
I mean,
same system.
I mean, look at Hezbollah. Like, ouch.
Totally. So I guess it's a question of how to untie the knot.
How do we untie the knot?
Feminine power.
Yes.
To untie the knot.
And patience.
Yes, and patience. Yes.
Yeah. I like that. I think that's a good visual. Okay, good. So, I'm feeling good. I think we got this is a good closure. I think we can leave our listeners with this image and this thought. So thank you for coming on the show.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Yeah, it was
such
a pleasure. I know. Always. And everybody out there, thank you for listening. And until next week, keep speaking war and sex. If I could make love incessantly, I would be God. If I could make love incessantly, I would be gone.